Uh-oh. David. Hello again friends, Dino here, and I start with what may become, in fact it is, a multiple apology. It's been a while since the last topic video. Now, okay, I've been quite busy with work, but I was kind of running out of ideas as well. Yes, at some point I said I was going to have to discuss David, but some of the opinions that I've got, I've kind of covered so much in other videos, but I've got to try to dedicate one to this character. So apologies all over the place here. First of all, the fact that it's been such a long time since the last video, also the fact that I'm going to be repeating stuff that you've heard me say in many other videos and live streams. Now, it is unfortunately unavoidable, but I'm sorry if some of this comes across as, oh, not that old thing again. And lastly, I'm only too aware that my assessment of David may be controversial. His portrayal in the game is such that to many he's regarded in some quite specific ways which I happen to believe are inaccurate and based on flimsy evidence. So apologies out of the way, let's have a look at this perhaps not so bad boy. He and James had an opportunity and a reason to kill Ellie on their first meeting. Are you saying a reason? Why? Okay, after the mine combat, David tells Ellie about most of the group he sent out being killed by a crazy man travelling with a little girl. You see, Ellie's mention of the need for antibiotics was almost certainly enough to convince David he'd found his culprit long before that later conversation. The men who returned may well have been aware of Joel's injury, but in any case, we're talking about the likelihood of this teen girl, already identified and probably described, not being the one standing in front of him now. It's pretty damned remote, he knows. Ah, you say, but he needs to let her go to be able to track her back to Joel. Not so. Ellie has already left a trail by reaching the mine while she was hunting the deer. That's their route to find Joel. All David and James have to do is hold her long enough to let a contingent set out on that trail, but they don't. Now, okay, James protests, but what is David's reasoning here? From their first encounter to the point where Ellie takes the medicine and leaves, David is never anything but friendly. He encourages and compliments her in the combat sections. He trusts her and gives her reason to trust him, even after he reveals that he knows who she is. He still offers protection. It's possible that he sanctions the pursuit of Ellie and Joel, but in all honesty, I'm not sure he cares about Joel at all, beyond the fact that it would be useful to get him out of the picture. But I really don't think he's concerned about revenge for the loss of his men. I mean, even the death of James, probably his closest ally, gets brushed off as an unfortunate occurrence, because in this world, death happens all the time. It's a constant threat. And David's group survives in part through cannibalism, so killing and being killed are just everyday hazards, pretty much routine. So why does David want Ellie captured alive? More to the point, why do we jump to a particular conclusion about that? Okay, let me try to answer the first part, ignoring everything that people tend to suspect. I'll just try to look at some aspects of David's world that are rarely considered or discussed. He and his group live in a remote area which is prone to hard winters, and it is remote. The university is in Boulder, Colorado, and this is the nearby town where David sent his men to look for food. Now obviously the game takes geographical liberties, but it tends not to overstep the mark in that regard. For example, in the opening scene with Tommy driving Sarah and Joel towards the town of Austin, we see several road signs naming real locations, suburbs of Austin, towns and cities further afield. But the way they're arranged and the mileages shown are such that the location of Joel's house couldn't exist in reality, but it would be in an area of suburban Austin. So if you find Boulder on a map, then head west to find an area of lakes, medium-sized mountains, a scenic touristy location. You'd have to travel something like 10 or 15 miles minimum, and that's straight line distance. It sure as hell isn't nearby. But if that's what they've had to get used to, maybe that's what they'll call it. The point is though, their communal life is harsh, and there's no evidence of them having crops and livestock as at Tommy's. David will be telling the truth. Their survival has to be by any means necessary. But we're not just talking about their need to resort to cannibalism. This is about the long-term survival of the group, that is, future generations. I firmly believe that David sees Ellie in only one way. In future years she will reach childbearing age, and that is his gift to his group. He hopes to provide them, albeit on a small scale, with a means to produce part of the next generation to help keep their community alive. I mean, as tough as their life is, there's no reason why they would have abandoned hope of the world ever recovering, but they need a purpose, and not dying out is a pretty good purpose. They will hope to be around if and when the infection burns itself out. Now, it sounds here like I'm trying to skirt around the issue of David being, as many believe, a paedophile. So, okay, let's just dive straight into that. There is a difference between the evidence suggesting he is not and then the opposite, in that the latter is based on hearsay and things which are very easily misconstrued. And I think it's a deliberate ploy by Naughty Dog, or largely to do with the brutality of Ellie's killing of David. We cannot be left in any doubt that it was justified. We need to feel that what Ellie overcame was the most obscene evil that ever entered her life. She did what she had to do because the alternative didn't bear thinking about, and of course it works. But the truth is that what she overcame was simply a man trying to kill her, nothing else. After all, in that combat, if you don't kill David, he kills you, and that, I'm sorry, that is not paedophilia. But let's go through the evidence and start with that which makes people believe he's a nonce. There are 3 bits to look at. 1.
Now I think it's your turn. It's the only way I'm going to be able to convince the others.
Convince them of what?
That you can come around. You have heart. You're loyal. And you're special.
Oh.
David needs Ellie to join his group for the reasons I mentioned earlier. But does he expect her to just say, okay, fuck Joel, I'll just stay here, seems nice? No, of course not. He's already seen that she's going to be difficult to persuade, and force isn't going to work. You can't force somebody to willingly join you. So it's vital to him that he makes her feel appreciated, valued. And if you listen carefully to the dialogue, that's all he does. Everything he says to her is understanding, respectful, reasoned. And for me, when he puts his hand on hers, there is one message, and only one. He's saying, whatever you want to believe, I am not a threat to you, not your enemy. Granted, Ellie sees something sinister in that, but she is as wrong as we are, makes the same assumption despite lack of evidence. In fact, what David needs more than anything is for Ellie to be on his side, which is what we see in the second piece of evidence.
She's alive. She's David's newest pet.
Regardless of how we see David, one thing is sure, he is not respected as a leader. We see members of his group openly disregarding and disobeying his instructions. There's even an off-camera dialogue about his leadership being put up to a vote. I mean, their immediate concern is that he's allowed an infected girl to be on the loose, but there's evidently some kind of long-standing problem with his leadership. We don't know what that is, but it sure as hell isn't paedophilia. This is a small town with a small population, which includes women and children. If David actually was a paedophile, he'd be dead. There are lines you don't cross. David isn't a Jimmy Savile with enormous wealth and power to silence people. He's just some guy, and they would crucify him if he posed a threat to their kids. I mean, describing Ellie as David's newest pet evidently refers to his repeated attempts to bring females into the group, but other than that, it's merely disrespectful banter. These guys dislike David. I talked about what would happen if the group knew he was a pedo, but of course there's a chance, 1 in a million admittedly, he could hide it. Well, unfortunately this newest pet comment blows that out of the water because it reveals that everybody knows, so sorry, but no, David would already be standing before his maker. 3.
Let me tell you something. You have no idea what I'm capable of.
Sorry guys, but it isn't a reference to paedophilia, and we've actually been over this part of the game. He's threatening to kill her, simple as that. And he's having a bit of a rage, to be honest. She's already stabbed him 3 times. He's properly pissed off and wants to scare the shit out of her. So, let's now look at the bits and pieces which, as evidence that David isn't a paedophile, somehow feel more substantial. We can start with something we've already covered, but it's still worth repeating. David's group includes women and children. If the comment David's newest pet is to be taken seriously, in other words, he's known to be a paedophile, he simply couldn't maintain his position as leader. As I said before, he wouldn't even be alive. But I'm saying all of this again for a reason. It makes logical sense, and for that reason we can dismiss it as evidence of paedophilia. And in doing that, we must call into question the other so-called evidence, not just because it can be dismissed, but because the David's newest pet thing is the only evidence which superficially seems to be overt, an actual statement of fact. The other two, you're special and you have no idea what I'm capable of, only exist as things to be interpreted. Often overlooked is the fact that David is religious. Now, we can put aside the subject of Catholic priests. We know the story there. It's about abusing positions of trust without fear of being condemned by the Vatican. That dirty world is not the same as David's, nor indeed that of any normal person who finds purpose in religion. I know plenty of people who, for whatever reason, take guidance from the Bible, and they don't do it to hide or indeed somehow condone paedophilia. They're just normal people, and in that respect so is David. And there are parts of his dialogue which show that while he's in a good mood at least and not being repeatedly stabbed by Ellie, he feels the weight of moral correctness. In the mine fight, for example, after finding the bodies of some of his people, he says, "Forgive them, Lord." So what does this refer to? Well, the only sin we're aware of is the group's cannibalism. And if this brief comment is referring to anything we should be aware of, it must be that. Put it this way, this certainly isn't a community of paedophiles. He can't be asking forgiveness for that. He knows in his heart that the community's cannibalism is an abomination, albeit vital to their survival. And it's referenced in the restaurant in our final encounter with David. We don't know precisely what purpose the restaurant serves. It may be just a communal eating place, or the venue for town meetings, or both. But it's evidently important enough to be the place where this banner appears prominently. And the use of the banner? To me, it's quite straightforward. Cannibalism is wrong, and it's possible that prior to David's leadership it just didn't feature in this community, but out of pure necessity driven by desperation he possibly instigated it. But you can't just do that and assume everyone is going to be fine with it. He shall provide. It's basically saying that whatever you feel about the morality, just see it as God's way of keeping us alive. He controls everything. Ultimately, it is his will. What I'm saying is David knows right from wrong, and he's far from comfortable with wrong. Misguided or not, he feels he has to resort to religion to at least partly assuage his guilt. But that guilt is there, and he's prepared to do something to address it, even though this cannibalism is what they're forced to do to survive. It seems a very big stretch, to me anyway, to think that he could also engage in paedophilia and somehow escape or be immune to the unjustifiable immorality of that. And we can't say that if cannibalism is necessary for the survival of the group, then he could regard paedophilia as a necessity for the provision of the next generation. Yeah, in extremely harsh times being fed is vital, but you can't say the same about producing babies or having sex unless you're just plain demented. And David isn't. Before Ellie really turns on him, He's a calm and reasonable human being. So, am I saying David is a good person? No. In the end, his determination to try and kill Ellie is the product of revenge, and that is never an acceptable excuse. But if we're going to hate David for his cannibalism, well, that's fine. But we must hate his group as well, because they're all guilty of it to the same degree. But we can't hate him because of a belief that he's a paedophile, because the evidence against him is it's not just feeble. It also, and this is with reference to David's newest pet, it even contradicts itself to the point that it becomes close to nonsensical. Let's put it in very simple terms, and imagine David living in our world and being arrested because he's suspected of it. If he was hauled up in court and exactly the same evidence we see was presented by the prosecution as the corpus of their case, it would be dismissed in seconds. David becomes an object of justifiable hate because he gives in to rage and wants to kill because of it, which, coincidentally, is exactly what Ellie does. Yes, of course, she had to kill him, otherwise there was no escape, but it was the rage that went into it. I sometimes wonder if Ellie's distracted state, as we begin the spring section, isn't so much because of her having to kill David, it's more to do with what she unleashed that went far beyond what she needed to do to get rid of him and get away. She lost herself in violence, and as a side note, that could make the sequel interesting. Will this be something she learns to control, or will it become a frequently seen part of her character? I only mention it because of something I said in another video, all to do with hoping I can still connect emotionally with Ellie. Anyway, there you go. There's my evaluation of David. By no means a good guy, but not the monster others think he is. Thanks for watching. Dino extracting the machete and calmly walking away.